Hello, everyone. This week we've been kind of asked to handle the problem of scale when it comes to how large a state grows and at what point is a republic too large that it can no longer really effectively govern. A lot of our readings were kind of based off that, as well as some of those lectures that we were asked to read, or sorry, listen to. And I really wanted to focus on that a little bit, but more on the concept of the problem of scale when it comes to national defense. I kind of partially handled this topic a little bit when I was doing my intellectual biography on Hamilton, which I did it on Hamiltonian ideas, kind of viewing of a standing army. And that's really not what the purpose of this is going to really be. But I really want to talk about what happens kind of dealing with those issues of scale when it comes to national defense. How do you properly manage these things a little bit as you continue to expand as a nation, and how that can really impact a republic when it comes to their national defense, and how that might turn into a threat for liberty. A lot of the founding fathers and Western philosophers were influenced by classical writers that came from Greece and Rome. And the main ones I plan to focus on are Livy and Sallust. Both of them lived after the Roman Republic fell. And Livy dedicated his history of Rome to, as he said, it traced the process of our moral decline to watch first the sinking of the foundations of morality as the old teachings were allowed to lapse. Many believe that standing armies of any sort would lead to despotism and tyranny in a republic, and were a drain on the national resources, kind of as a takeaway from the lesson of Rome. And so, kind of the big thing is as a country grows, whether it be a republic, a democracy, or a kingdom, its security needs increase, and as a result, the army that it currently has, or whatever army system that it's using, may no longer really be sufficient to properly defend the state. And so you might need to take in reforms to change things. And so you might run into the fact that the militia might not really be sufficient to handle a foreign adversary anymore, or you really need to reform your system in order to deal with new issues. When it comes to Livy's work, he's going to really highlight the virtues of the militia. He's going to kind of criticize standing armies, not so much use the term like militia or standing armies and things like that, but it's ultimately going to kind of follow that pattern. Um, Livy's history starts at the beginning. He talks about how early Roman kings shaped the Roman army, and he almost all of them contribute something positive to Rome's foundations, except for the last king, Tarquin the Proud. But what we're going to kind of focus on is King Servius Tullius. He introduced significant reforms to Rome, and notably, it was conducting Rome's first census. The census was crucial for organizing public service, whether it be in peace or war, and it was based off of a system of property and wealth. Romans were divided into 6 classes, and those classes were based off of wealth, with the first class being the most wealthy in Roman society, and then the last class being those with very little property or no property at all. And that determined their military obligations. For classes 1 through 5, those they had to purchase their own military equipment. They were not paid. They may receive a stipend for supplies, but they weren't paid anything for military service initially. And all of them had different levels of equipment they had to purchase. So those in the first class had to purchase heavy armor, and they had to bring in, be able to fund the engineering portion of the Roman army as well. The only class that had no military obligations was the poor, the 6th class, those with no property. They were exempt from military service. And voting rights were also tied to this system. The wealthier classes had more influence. They had more of a say in society. Their vote could count for like 4 times more than that of a 6th class. So everybody got a chance to vote, but really the wealthy's vote carried more in Roman society. But like I said, initially this system was a militia-based society where the wealthy bore greater military responsibilities within it, and they had more say in political matters. And the idea, and Livy won't necessarily directly say it, was that the wealth of made the wealth of those wealthier citizens made them less susceptible to manipulation by ambitious military leaders. And so it kind of offset you giving somebody a lot of power. And this really works well when Rome is really small. And it works well because you can roll out the militia quickly and you can handle a problem, and they're not paid, they're not going to be on a campaign for very long. But eventually, Rome starts having to deal with much more wider conflicts within the Italian peninsula itself, and so the Senate later decreed payment for soldiers out of public funds, according to Livy. And that's kind of a departure from that pure militia model. Livy doesn't condemn it. He actually doesn't have an issue with the fact that the army gets paid eventually, because this change does allow for longer periods of service, but it doesn't actually end up preventing soldiers from facing poverty during prolonged conflicts, like the Punic Wars, which lasted for long periods of time. And because they had this militia-based system, the longer a soldier was in military service, especially if he did not have a lot of property to begin with, that's a longer amount of time that he's away from the farm, and he's less able to be able to take care of his personal affairs. And so again, as Rome expands, like during the Punic Wars, as the state expands, as security needs increase, soldiers need to be in longer terms of service, and they're not really able to always take care of the property at home. So a lot of them fall into poverty after those wars, and some of them into slavery. And so that put Rome in a crisis over land reform, because if your soldiers are losing their land, and what ends up happening is the wealthy ends up purchasing it, you're starting to lose the amount of people in society who are eligible for property ownership or military requirements. And so there's a lot of key figures in Roman history, like the Gracchi brothers or Catiline and Caesar, who advocated for redistributing land from the wealthy to the poor to try to kind of address this issue in Roman society. And they also needed more soldiers, right? So you have two problems. You have the fact that Rome needed more soldiers due to expansion, because it needed to occupy further distant territories, and that put more strain on that property-based military system as well as on the Republic. And this really comes to a head during the Jugurthine War, where Gaius Marius, who's the gentleman on the left in my pictures here, Servius Tullus is the man on the right, but during the Jugurthine War in North Africa, Gaius Marius, who's a new man, doesn't come from an established family, starts recruiting soldiers from the lower classes, and he bypasses the traditional recruiting methods within Rome. And this is a problem, and Roman historian Sallust notes this shift. He says that Marius may have done this because there was a lack of eligible recruits in Rome, but he also says that Marius may have done this as, quote, a desire to pay court to the poorer classes, because it was by that order of men that he had been honored and promoted. And indeed, to a man grasping at power, the most needy are the most serviceable, persons to whom their property, as they have none, is not an object of care, and to whom everything lucrative appears honorable. And so essentially Rome, this republic, runs into the issue as it expands, its military becomes corrupted because it's now being filled in by these poorer members of society who have less obligation to the state. And one of the historians I read for my paper notes that this change to bring in the lower classes that don't have property led to a stronger allegiance between the soldiers and their commanders rather than the state. And as this historian has stated, Rome did not develop other means to control its commanders. Their authority to distribute war booty and provincial tribute to their soldiers enabled them to create armies that were loyal to themselves rather to Rome. And so that definitely becomes a problem as Rome starts to expand and is in a distant area. The Republic is starting to be corrupted by their expansion, and there's less control over the army. And of course, Marius becomes very significant because Marius is the first to really march on the city of Rome itself. Marius and Sulla's conflict will end up happening. He'll get in a conflict with a former subordinate. The two of them will start the first Roman civil war, and they will both occupy the Roman Republic, make demands at the end of a sword to the Roman Republic. And Julius Caesar himself will later on do this after the first Roman Civil War, and he will essentially kind of just nail the coffin shut. And so eventually what essentially happens in Rome is they grow to a point that their military becomes corrupted. It's no longer this militia-based system. And I actually wouldn't say that our founding fathers, like Washington and Hamilton, would have advocated for a militia system in the way that we think of it today. But certainly as the state grows, its security needs grows and its desire or need, especially in a republic, to be able to control the army so that it doesn't overthrow the state, is really clear through Livy's sources and Sollus's sources, where they kind of really pointed to those things as an example of the corruption of Rome. So I really appreciate you listening through this. I know I went a little bit over the time, but I really wanted to focus on this because I think as a state it grows, of course, its security needs grows, but how do we control and make sure that the military itself does not become a threat to liberty and freedom, so that it could also be turned on the people? And how do you make military leaders accountable? I think Americans have really managed to solve that issue a little bit, but more from having a good first commander for our army in the case of Washington. But all these things I think are really kind of illustrate on a more micro level, kind of a side aspect of what happens when a state grows too big, it gets very large. How do you deal with the army, and how do you ensure that the army remains committed to the republic, liberty, and freedom? And so thank you for joining me, and I appreciate you for hearing me out. And I really enjoyed this class, and I hope to have a class with you guys in the future. Thank you. Goodbye.